What's up, heathens? How ya doing? Today we're going to be looking at how historically inaccurate this statement is.
Moreover, it's the kind of thing Christians wouldn't make up because it was embarrassing for your Messiah to die. The idea of a Messiah was that they would come down and they would have a military victory over Rome and destroy Rome. And the idea of a Messiah dying, let alone dying in a way that suggested he was cursed by God, is something that you wouldn't make up.
Yes, today we are discussing the idea of a pre-Christian dying Messiah that would absolve the sins of the Jewish people who would then also be resurrected. If you're interested in this mythicist content, then please stay tuned. I want to start off this video stating that I have no issue at all with Cameron. This video is not meant to be antagonizing, and I don't suggest that anybody antagonize anyone over this issue. Cameron starts off his video stating the thesis of his evangelism.
Oh, sorry, you startled me. Did you guys know that Christianity is true? And I don't mean just like, yeah, it's this thing that I say that's true. No, it is actually true. Evidentially, historically, it's true. Christianity is true. You know, that's something I say a lot on this channel, by the way. Christianity is true.
Of course, I disagree that Christianity is evidentially and historically accurate, meaning that it comports with reality. Evidentially and historically, that is not the case. So, Cameron, what are we discussing today?
I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and the video that you're about to watch features an in-depth discussion between myself and two experts on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus.
Oh, experts, you say? The video title suggests that we are talking about the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, so I can only assume that you have two historical experts that you're talking to.
One of them has been on the show before, Callum Miller, Dr. Callum Miller. Doctor, not in just the sense that he's got a PhD and stuff, but he also is actually a medical doctor.
Oh, so not a historical expert. He's a medical doctor that occasionally researches biblical topics to advance his apologetics and his evangelism. Got it. Maybe this other guy is an expert in history.
But Max, you're new to the show, so tell everyone, what should we know about you, Max? And first of all, how do you pronounce your last name?
It's Baker Heitch.
Baker Height. Okay. I just tried to do your accent. Baker Height. Okay. Awesome.
Right.
So what should we know about you, Max?
I'm a lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, which is part of the University of Oxford. So I did my PhD in philosophy at Oxford, finished in 2014.
So he's not an expert either. You see, I'm rather confused by this because your title suggests that they are scholars, and then you introduce them as experts in the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, but yet they're not experts in history. Unless you define expert as just somebody who has spent a reasonable amount of time researching the issue. If that's the case, then I too am an expert with an unrelated advanced degree. Good thing that we're on the same level here, because otherwise it would be a non-historian arguing with a historian, which I really have no problem with. But at least now you can't throw it in my face that I'm not an expert in this field. So, what kind of historiography do these non-historian experts bring to the table?
Yeah, I think one thing that's often, comes as a shock to people who haven't been exposed to the study of ancient history before is just that it's actually very normal in the study of ancient history for a source which is regarded as very reliable by professional historians to have been written several decades after the events that it recounts. So I think sometimes in sort of more popular level online expressions of skepticism about the resurrection or just the Gospels more generally, you have people demanding, sources that were written at the time of the events, which is understandable from the point of view of, modern day expectations, when obviously we have newspapers that are written the next day about events. But actually in the ancient world, most people couldn't read and write, and And also people had to be much more proficient at retaining information without being able to write it down. And so ancient historians are unfazed by having to deal with sources that are written from our point of view a long time after the events.
Actually, obtaining contemporaneous eyewitness accounts is the goal of a historian. More specifically speaking, historians rely on the earliest accounts that we can have. These two experts are painting historical sources as generally occurring decades after the event or person supposedly existed. This is not indicative of what actually goes on in historiography. Generally speaking, historians that are given sources that are dated decades after the supposed person or event happened, they would want to know what source that source is using. It could be something that's not extant to us now, but that they have access to. Take Alexander the Great, for instance. Now, Arrian, who is considered to have the best history on Alexander the Great, had access to eyewitness sources that we don't have access to now. These eyewitness sources would have been two of Alexander the Great's generals. While Arrian was writing hundreds of years later, the sources he was using were eyewitness sources. So no, we don't just expect contemporaneous eyewitness accounts for things that are closer to modern times. We also expect this quality of evidence when examining ancient history. They mention how not everybody could read and write at this point in history, but all we're asking is that the people that could read and write would read and write about things that were happening while they were living. That's not really a big ask. It's a much bigger ask to expect those accounts to be preserved through time. They also mention how people were more proficient with their memory at that point, but that doesn't really help us either. We would still expect these historical sources to cite sources that were contemporaneous or eyewitness accounts. The key point here is that we want as close to contemporaneous eyewitness accounts as we can get. If the document was written during the supposed time of the eyewitnesses, then we should expect to see those eyewitnesses being cited.
The time gaps between the sources about Jesus and the events are actually compare very favorably, especially when we take into account, and we'll discuss this more obviously, some of these sort of oral summaries that we find embedded in Paul's letters particularly, seem to go back to within like years or even months of the events. Then that actually is very a very kind of nice situation to be in for an ancient historian.
I agree. That is a very nice place for a historian to be. But that still doesn't help your case for the resurrection of Jesus. You see, Paul adamantly states that he did not get his information from any person on earth. He only got it from a celestial Jesus through visions and the scriptures. This is simply not what we find for other historical figures at the time. We find actual earthly sources, not celestial ones. The Gospels are not considered reliable sources because, for one, they don't cite any kind of sources for their information, and two, the timeline in which these Gospels were written. Mark is our earliest Gospel, but even there, he shows signs of using Paul's theology to inform his work. Mark also seems to derive his story of Jesus from another Jesus, Jesus ben Ananias, who also shares 23 common plot points between them. The other Gospels redact and build upon Mark, so you really only have Mark as the only independent Gospel that there is. That's why the Gospels are not regarded as reliable documents. So we've kind of established you're at least not experts on critical historiography. You're experts in Christian apologetics that have some cherry-picked historical facts thrown in there. Are you at least experts on Christian theology?
But we also have Paul's letters, and Paul unquestionably knew some of the major eyewitnesses, and was writing at a time when those eyewitnesses were still alive, and Paul had clearly received information from them about the circumstances surrounding Jesus' death. So
what? That would completely undermine Paul's entire message of Galatians 1. In order to be an apostle, Paul could not have gotten his information from any person on earth and only through a celestial Jesus through visions and scriptures. Any information that he would have gotten from a person on earth would have nullified his status as an apostle. So you're not experts on historical research, and you're not experts on Christian theology. What are you experts on? Because I have no idea. So what kind of historical evidence do you have exactly?
So, for example, we know from non-Christian sources alone, from people like Josephus and Tacitus and Pliny and Suetonius, we know that Jesus was a wise man. He worked miracles. He was called the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Multiple non-Christian sources say that. But also he was prayed to as a god or worshipped as a god. We know Christians met on a fixed day, which we think is likely the Sunday, which is interesting for reasons we'll get into in a little while.
Okay, so Josephus was written near the end of the 1st century, and there are multiple papers that are written on how the Testimonium Flavianum is simply nothing that Josephus would actually write. It was most likely inserted by a later Christian scribe. This would be like Eusebius of Caesarea or his mentor. The second passage, the James reference, is most likely interpolated because later on in that very same passage, they reference a completely different Jesus. The portion at the beginning that identifies this Jesus as the Christ looks more like a marginal scribal note than it does an actual thing that Josephus would write. Whew! And then there's Tacitus, which is the thing that apologists love to bring out. If we take Tacitus at face value, all that we can really say is that Christians were in Rome during the burning of Rome. And that's all we can really say about it. You see, Tacitus was writing to Pliny the Younger, who he was regular pen pals with. So he would have most likely gotten any actual Jesus Christ specific information from Pliny the Younger, who was currently interrogating Christians at the time. So really, all Tacitus does is reflect the current 2nd century beliefs of Christians. There actually is good evidence to suggest that this was interpolated, though, at least the portions that are very specific to what's in the Gospels. For one thing, the Christus that appears in Tacitus is actually Christus. It's been changed through scribal interpolations. And then, of course, as I said with Pliny, he was writing in the 2nd century as well. He was interrogating Christians, and so therefore he was just regurgitating 2nd century Christian beliefs. Suetonius is in the same realm as Tacitus, because Suetonius, all he does is places the Christians in the 50s in that area. That's nothing that we already didn't know. We already knew that information. You see, this is what I mean by critical examination of the evidence. What you gotta do is take off your Christ-colored glasses and actually critically look at the evidence. I mean, you guys aren't even trying to feign it. Hell, they go on to say that the Jews weren't even expecting a resurrecting Messiah.
You can actually begin to build a case that there must have been something like an empty tomb and some appearances of Jesus, or what they thought were appearances of Jesus. Otherwise, they just never would have begun to use that word or believe in the resurrection or make these sorts of claims.
So as we start to fill out the case, I'm thinking of like 2 different things that would bear on what you were just talking about, and in specifically with respect to what resurrection meant. And so Sadducees and Pharisees back then did not believe in a kind of resurrection prior to the end of the world. They didn't believe that resurrection was going to happen to like one person instead of all people. And then I can't remember if it's the Pharisees or the Sadducees. I think it's the Sadducees that didn't believe in resurrection at all.
Mm-hmm.
This is completely contradictory to historical accounts of Second Temple Judaism. For one, the Talmud preserves a pre-Christian ideology that contains 2 messiahs, a Messiah ben Joseph and a Messiah ben David. And in this particular ideology, Messiah ben Joseph would suffer and die, and then Messiah ben David would come in and resurrect Messiah ben Joseph to absolve the sins of the Jewish people. Does this sound familiar? You see, what the Christians did was they took this ideology, mashed the 2 Messiah figures together, and then you have Jesus Christ. The alternative to this is that the Jews and the Christians independently came up with the exact same ideology, just one minute difference. The invented once kind of hypothesis here seems to be a lot more likely than the invented twice idea. But even still, even if they did independently invent the same ideology, that would mean that they used the scriptures in order to do it. And you know what? The apocalypse of Zerubbabel, it confirms what the Talmud is saying. It too has these two messiahs. Another Jewish source that indicates a resurrected Messiah is the Wisdom of Solomon. Now, this is a 1st century Jewish source, but it preserves a much older ideology. And it was very important to the 1st century Christians. Later on in this stream, you even repeat the Pauline Creed, which has, according to the scriptures, in reference to the resurrection.
And what he says there is that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, i.e. the brother of Jesus, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me.
Of course, y'all say in accordance with the scriptures, so that it seems like real events comported with what the scriptures said, instead of Paul getting his information directly from the scriptures. These scriptures would be Daniel and Isaiah. Either way, though, this conclusively shows that at least some Jews were expecting a resurrected Messiah.
But then also in Deuteronomy 21 and 22, which is something that you've pointed out before, Callum. I can't remember when, but I first heard this from you, which is kind of interesting. But in Deuteronomy 21:22, it says pretty explicitly that anyone hanged on a cross or a tree is cursed. And so basically after that, the disciples had every reason, it seems like, to go home and start over because their leader was cursed.
Wait, how does this make any sense at all? I mean, Jesus supposedly took on the sins of all of the Jews and then was sacrificed in a blood magic ritual to absolve all of the sins. This comports with the Deuteronomy 21:22-23 that you were talking about. It also comports with the least shall be first theme of the entire gospel. I mean, he was cursed and disgraced by the current Jewish Sanhedrin. They were the bad guys in the gospel. So how does the crucifixion not match what the Jews were expecting for the Messiah? To make matters worse, if we just looked at the Jewish theological documents, we would see that the Messiah was to be put to a shameful death. The Wisdom of Solomon, if you recall, is a 1st century Jewish work, says this: "Let us examine him with despitefulness and torture, that we may know his meekness and prove his patience. Let us condemn him with a shameful death, for by his own saying he shall be respected." Wisdom of Solomon 2:19-20. And even in the scriptures, as cited by Paul and the Gospels, you get this idea of a disgraced and cursed Messiah. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Isaiah 53:3. So yes, at least some Jews were expecting the Messiah to experience a shameful death. I feel like what Cameron and the two experts are doing here is that they are painting the Jewish landscape of theology at the time through a very broad brush of just one particular idea. They are negating all of the other ideas included in the Jewish landscape, which would have included the sect of Jews that eventually became Christians.
So yeah, I think the fact that they rejected the idea of a resurrection, they rejected the idea that it would happen in the middle of history to one person. They rejected the idea that the Messiah would die. All of these facts kind of give a background that make it difficult to explain why Christians began to worship and believe in the resurrection of someone who was crucified and therefore seen as cursed by God.
As I've shown, any time that you hear anybody saying stuff like this, you can be assured that it's revisionist history and they are preaching apologetics and not talking about actual history. Also, being cursed by your enemies isn't a bad thing. When I get some dumbass that puts me up on a poll for the worst atheist ever because they are a Christian and are offended by me being an atheist, I don't take that as an insult.
Yeah, so I think the first place that is very natural to begin, and where most biblical scholars do begin when talking about the New Testament sources, is so Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. So Paul, in this letter to the Corinthian church, written in about 55 AD, alludes to the fact that when he was with them the first time, which for other reasons we could go into gets dated to about 51 AD. So Paul alludes to the fact that when he was with them then, in about 51 AD, he passed on to them this formula or summary, if you like. And you find it in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And it begins by Paul saying, what I passed on to you as of first importance, what I received myself, I passed on to you as of first importance. And then he goes on to list in chronological order Jesus' death, his burial, then being raised on the third day, then appearing to Peter, the 12, 500 at once, and then James, and finally the appearance to Paul himself. So this summary is very important because, well, there's a couple of reasons why it's very important. One is that Paul clearly received it from others, and there's every indication that those others he received it from were the individuals who are named in that summary.
This is a rehash of the Gary Habermas video that I posted last week. First, you guys forgot the according with the scriptures here, which later you kind of use a variant of according to the scriptures. You say in accordance with the scriptures. Now, this seems to indicate that you're changing the intent of the text in order to match your conclusion that they are just saying that, oh, these real events comport with what the prophecy said. But that's not what Paul actually says. Saying according to the scriptures indicates that that's where he gets his information from. You see, Paul couldn't have known this historically. He could only have known it through revelation through Jesus Christ and the scriptures. He says this countless times in his writings. Second, no, like I said, Paul did not get his information from any historical source. That would have completely nullified his status as an apostle. Apostles, all the apostles, only got their information through a vision of Jesus and the scriptures. Paul did not get his information from James or Cephas. As I said in the Habermas video, there is nuance to this particular topic, because where Paul actually got his information from and where he claims to have gotten his information from could be completely different. The main takeaway, though, is that Paul has separated himself completely from any earthly source. If Paul has completely separated himself from any earthly source, that means that you can't use him to historically place Jesus in history.
And actually, the Greek word historeo is the verb that Paul actually uses in Galatians 1:18, and it means to sort of go on a fact-finding mission. So yeah, Paul would obviously have wanted to know what Peter and James knew, and so yeah, he had ample opportunity to check out this information from them. And so yeah, this summary that we find in 1 Corinthians 15 is very significant. For one thing, because Paul got it from the witnesses themselves.
No, this whole idea would completely destroy the point of Galatians 1. I mean, I have no idea why you guys are trying to retcon the Bible here. I mean, directly before that passage, Paul says that he didn't get his information from any person on earth. He only got it from Jesus and the scriptures. Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Again, this is the same thing that Habermas does. They are reading information into the text that, one, simply isn't there, and that, two, is completely contradictory to Paul's message in general. Another thing is that Paul never mentions that anybody was an eyewitness to Jesus. He never uses the word disciple at all. What you're doing is taking information that didn't exist until 70 CE and then placing that in Paul's mouth, which was 20 years prior to that. I mean, anybody that could just read the text would know that you're blowing smoke up their ass. To be clear, I'm fine if you want to date the Pauline Creed to the early 30s. That is not my issue here. My only issue here is that it's theologically backwards to claim that Paul got his information from any human source.
So he starts with Christ being crucified or killed according to the scriptures. And this is something that there's not a historian in the world who would doubt for a second.
You see, the fact that you guys keep repeating this particular line in the Pauline Creed where it says, according to the scriptures, and then you turn around and then you say that they weren't expecting this.
So yeah, I think the fact that they rejected the idea of a resurrection, they rejected the idea that it would happen in the middle of history to one person. They rejected the idea that the Messiah would die.
You see, if it's in the scriptures and they were reading the scriptures to gain information about Jesus, like Paul says, then they were completely expecting the Messiah to be disgraced and killed. Also, I want to address the appeal to authority here. The fact that historians agree on something does not speak to the truth of it. How we understand history changes with new evidence and new understandings of current evidence. Evolution and climate change aren't real things because the consensus says so. It's because of the mountain of evidence that the consensus is built upon. And that's how it should be for historical studies too.
And the reason scholars think this is really convincing is for a number of reasons. First, it's in a bunch of the non-Christian sources. So Josephus says it, Tacitus says it, Lucian of Samosata says it, Marabar Serapion says it, and the Talmud, which is a bit later but based on probably quite a strong Jewish tradition, also says that he was crucified or hung specifically on the eve of Passover.
So Josephus and Tacitus I've already covered. Lucian and Marabar Serapion only regurgitate common Christian beliefs of the 2nd century. And this comes from Robert Van Voorst, who is also a Christian scholar. I'm not exactly sure why the Talmud makes the list here. The Talmud does talk about a Jesus, but this particular Jesus has a number of differences between the Jesus of the Gospels. Namely, that this particular Jesus existed around 100 years prior to when the Jesus of the Gospels supposedly existed. I'm really not sure how you get around this fact. And we know this particular Jesus also had a following after his death because Epiphanius actually records that.
Moreover, it's the kind of thing Christians wouldn't make up because it was embarrassing for your Messiah to die. The idea of a Messiah was that they would come down and they would have a military victory over Rome and destroy Rome. And the idea of a Messiah dying, let alone dying in a way that suggested he was cursed by God, is something that you wouldn't make up. It would be like making up a superhero and trying to convince everyone they were a superhero and saying all these awful things about them, like they used to kill people or do these horrible things, or that God cursed them, that kind of thing. It's not the thing you'd make up. So it's almost certainly rooted in historical truth.
First, I do agree that Christians wouldn't make this up, primarily because Christians would already believe these theological principles of their religion. I do think there was an already pre-existing idea that the Jewish Messiah would come, be disgraced, be killed, and then resurrected. I do think that there was an already pre-existing theological position held by some Jews that their Messiah would come, suffer, be disgraced, die, and resurrect, all to absolve them of their sins. This is what is meant by according to the scriptures. The criterion of embarrassment isn't particularly helpful here because it's inherently flawed. I mean, it assumes that something was embarrassing when we have proven that it was not embarrassing and it was indeed expected. The Talmud, the Wisdom of Solomon, the Apocalypse of Zerubbabel, Daniel, Isaiah, all of those Jewish theological works would have informed this sect of Jews about their coming Messiah. They confirmed that they expected a suffering, dying, and resurrecting Messiah. And therefore, it just cannot be embarrassing. I did contact Cameron with my issues in this portion of the video. He was able to ask Max about this particular point in the interview, and he had this to say. I'll speak for myself, but I don't think we need to rely on the criterion of embarrassment for our certainty that Jesus was crucified. We have multiple attestation to the nth degree for this particular event, like up to 10 sources when you include the non-Christian ones. So whilst I think it's not insignificant that the Jews of the 1st century would naturally have found the idea of a crucified Messiah bizarre and even offensive, we aren't remotely dependent upon that point for our surety of the crucifixion. Except we don't have any independent corroboration, like he suggests, for the reasons that I've already discussed here. I hope that I have sufficiently proven to you that at least some sect of Jews out there were expecting a dying, disgraced, killed, and resurrected Messiah. This is only hour 1 of the 3-hour discussion that Cameron had. I do appreciate Cameron having this discussion because it's a perfect example of the apologetics surrounding the resurrection of Jesus and the history of Jesus in general. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. If you will, please go down below, leave me your thoughts on this video today. What do you think of the dying and rising Messiah in Judaism? While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of mythicist content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.